All righty. Hello, everybody. And thank you for tuning in with us today on our first ever webinar. I'm Hillary Blout. I'm the Executive Director of For the People, and we are so glad that everyone has taken the time to spend some of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in, to hear from these amazing panelists that are so gracious to spend their time with us as well. And so, as you can see, we are joined here today by Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh, and also DA Jeff Reisig here from California, and then also Mr. Troy Dunmore. And you are going to get to hear a little bit more from each of them. But the purpose of this webinar is really so that you can understand what this term that you may have been hearing about called prosecutor-initiated resentencing is. And you can hear from people and their perspectives on how it is working in their counties, in their state, across the country, and in their lives. So with that, we are going to kick ourselves off with talking a little bit about the report that we just produced. This is the first ever report that has been published about prosecutor-initiated resentencing. And in this report, what we wanted to do was just highlight a few of the findings from this report for you. And then after that, we are going to turn it over to talk with Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh and hear about her perspective from the national landscape of what's happening around second look sentencing. And then after that, we're going to hear from DA Jeff Reisig, who is the District Attorney of Yolo County and also the president of the California District Attorneys Association. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to be able to hear from Mr. Troy Dunmore about his experience actually going through the resentencing process and his recent journey here in my home city in Oakland, California. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and pop up our slides. All right, great. So prosecutor-initiated resentencing is a process that we actually pioneered here in California. So this is what we call, it's also called PIR, if you hear that terminology throughout today's webinar. And what this is it is an activation of the power of prosecutors to remedy and address excessive sentences. That's what it is. In 2018, we conceptualized this concept and secured the passage of the first ever law. And candidly, we didn't know it was the first law in the country. We thought because prosecutors have the ability to seek very long sentences, that certainly they had the power to also go back to the court and ask the judge to resentence and release somebody. So we were candidly surprised that law didn't exist, but very grateful that we were able to get this done first in the country. And it went into effect in 2019. And it's called AB 2942 for those that want to look up the legislation. And again, this is called prosecutor-initiated resentencing. And the reason that this was passed and why we worked so hard to get this law on the books is really from the firm belief that prosecutors are elected by the people to advance justice. And so with that, it also includes looking back at past sentences. And if it comes to their attention, or they've even prosecuted a case themselves that they think about, they should absolutely have the power to be able to go back, review these cases, and bring them to court, and have the opportunity to reunite families and reunite communities with this law. So after initiating this and getting this law passed here in California, this report has enabled us to share an in-depth look. Basically, over the last 3 years of this law being here in California, this report is capturing a lot of information about our findings. So a lot of research, a lot of projections, and then most importantly, stories of the people that have been resentenced and released and back in our our communities. So I want to share now some of the kind of landmark findings from this report. Essentially, it is showing us kind of the headline here. Prosecutor-initiated resentencing has the ability to remedy the harm that has been caused in the way that the criminal justice system has been operating. And most importantly, it has the ability to remedy and address the racial disparities that we see day in, day out in our criminal justice system. So first, we found that about 80% of the people here in California are people of color. So when I say that, this work advances any type of racial justice initiatives, we mean it, because any way that you look and do this work here in California, you are able to address racial disparities in our system. Additionally, we actually did some calculations and projections on how many people are in prison right now that have already served a significant period of their sentence. So what we'll see, and you'll hear a little bit about this from one of our panelists, that thematically across the country, we are seeing legislatures and advocates and academia really encouraging looking back at past sentences when people have already served a significant period of time, right? 10 years, a decade of somebody's life. People are certainly different today than they were when they committed the crime 10 years ago. And here in California, nearly half of our prison population has already served 10 years or more. And so one of the other things that we looked into, and I think it's really important that the viewers today understand this, that putting people in prison, not only because of the kind of harm that it can cause if somebody is sort of separated from their family, but it isn't free, right? It costs, at least here in California, it costs over $100,000 per year to have somebody incarcerated. And so we actually looked at some of the projections here in California, and in 2022, California is slated to spend $871 million to keep about 8,500 people in prison who have already served 10 years of their sentence and serving for the kinds of sentences that many DAs here in California that are using this prosecutor-initiated resentencing law, PIR, the kinds of cases that they are evaluating. And I know that anybody viewing today could certainly think of other ways that we could be spending this money, especially when we are come to meet the folks, and you'll meet one today, who no longer need to be incarcerated. The other finding that we've realized is that there is an organization, a strategy around looking back at recidivism, looking at some of the statistics that are provided from our prison. And in doing so, we were able to determine that there's about 26,000 people who are currently incarcerated in the California State Prison who could be safely released if prosecutor-initiated resentencing and other mechanisms were taken to scale. And so you can see this number, you can do the math, and you can obviously deduce that this also means that there's a ton of savings that could come back to our communities and could also be used on the front end to prevent crime from even starting. And then another finding from our report is that there is an organization that we are so proud to be working with at Silicon Valley Debug, and they work on a model called participatory defense. And this work is something that we found is really critical for prosecutors to be considering in partnering. And what this model does is that they work in a true partnership with community leaders who are helping to amplify the voices of family members who have a loved one that is incarcerated. And so this is another finding from our report that really articulates the value of having incarcerated loved ones involved in this evaluation to be able to tell the stories of their loved ones and really be able to illustrate who the person was before the crime was committed, what they've been doing since they've been incarcerated, and then, as you can see here, the chapters that have yet to be written. Next slide, please. All right, and I wanted to just share with you some of the impacts to date. And again, there's a lot more details in our report on this. But as I mentioned, the law has been around now in effect for 3 years. And to date, we've already seen over 100 people who have been resentenced and released as a result of this new law here in California. And there are hundreds of cases under review right now. Many people were surprised that DAs would want to be involved in this work. You'll hear from one today about why he is involved. But to date, there's over a dozen offices here in California who are doing this work, who are partnering with us, using the law and looking back at their prison population to find folks that can be safely released and reunited with their families. And then a little bit about the national work, which we'll also hear about, that this is something that is taken off nationally, right? So our issues around incarceration and our efforts around decarceration, this is a national effort. And so we're seeing across the country, 10 plus states that have already proposed and are trying to get this PIR law passed in their home state as well. And here you can see a little bit about the national work. You can see here that this law has actually been replicated in a few other places. And so Illinois and Washington State and Oregon have already passed a PIR law in their state. They're actively using this law. And then you can see some of the other states that have proposed the law, and then other partners that we work with that actually do have a mechanism that may not be as clean or easy to use as PIR, but they do have existing legal mechanisms and are actively reviewing past cases. I wanted to also name something that I think is really, really important, especially for prosecutors that are tuning in from across the country, and also organizers, that obviously the work to review cases, get them to court, do the resentencing, and then bring people home does have a cost associated with it, right? What we have found is that prosecutors, at least here in California, before funding, which I'll talk about briefly, that they were able to bring some of the work within existing conviction integrity units. So if there are DAs that are tuning in and don't have funding, please know that there is a way to do this work. Even if you aren't able to launch a unit, there are ways to do this work right now, and we're happy to talk to anybody that wants to learn more about how to do that. But last year, we're really grateful that the California legislature made a significant investment into this work. So $18 million came to 9 different counties here in California, and this is a 3-year investment. And essentially, the funding, it is restricted in that the recipients in these 9 counties can only use this money for prosecutor-initiated resentencing. They can only use it to look back at past cases, reevaluate, get cases back to court. The distribution of the funds is going to 3 different entities. We feel very, very strongly that the collaborative model is critical. And so funding here is going to DA offices, public defender offices, and also community-based organizations that are trained in helping people in their journey of reentry. And then RAND is also doing a study and evaluation on all of this work as well. Next slide, please. We will be able to hear from Mr. Troy Dunmore, but we really encourage folks to look at our website. Please read about the stories. There's lots of misperceptions about, crime rates and how this might impact public safety. And when you read the stories about the people that have come home and been reunited with their families, you will know, and you can hopefully amplify these stories, that this work is actually about strengthening communities. This is actually about preventing crime. This is about reuniting families. So please take some time to read about the men and women who have been resentenced, and it's on our website, and you can learn more about those folks. And so with that, I'm going to take the slide down, and I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague and mentor who has been at this far longer than I have, Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll just kick it off by asking you, what do you see from your vantage point in the landscape of the national work that you were doing as a researcher at the Sentencing Project? What are you seeing in terms of second look sentencing, and how this work, prosecutor-initiated resentencing, really fits into that national landscape?
Thank you so much, Hillary. You and your organization's work is a real inspiration to me, so it's a real honor to be included as part of this webinar. So we at the Sentencing Project have, for a couple of years now, had a campaign to move towards ending life imprisonment and to limit most prison terms to 20 years. And we see second look reforms as an important tool for achieving that goal. And second look can be defined pretty broadly to include prosecutor-initiated resentencing, efforts to make people eligible for parole consideration or to make parole consideration more meaningful, as well as enabling people to directly petition the courts for resentencing themselves. So last year, we published a report on second look reforms. It was called The Second Look at Injustice, and it did two things. It profiled reform efforts in a couple different jurisdictions. So For the People's work was a major part of that, and I appreciate all of the help, guidance that you provided to help us understand what's been going on in California. Also included efforts in New York to pass an elder parole bill so that people who are age 55 and older and have served 15 years in prison can become eligible for parole consideration. And then included also the reform in DC, the sentencing reform, the Second Look Amendment Act in 2020. And so let me just share a couple insights about looking specifically at the DC reform, since we're going to be talking about California here. But so in looking at the DC reform, what I found was two things that really stood out. One of them being that the incremental nature of the reform. So Washington, D.C.'s council first passed legislation in response to the Supreme Court decisions, Graham and Miller, making life without parole sentences much more limited for people who committed crimes under age 18. And so they passed second look legislation a couple years ago to allow that population to petition for resentencing after 20 years of imprisonment. Then they passed legislation to cut that time period down to 15 years. And then the most recent reform passed in 2020 expanded that possibility for resentencing to emerging adults as well. So to people who committed their offense under the age of 25, allowing them to petition for resentencing after 15 years. And currently there's a bill that's being considered to further expand the reform so that everyone who spent 15 years in prison in DC can petition for resentencing. So the incremental nature stood out to me. The other point that I wanted to highlight about it is how broadly supported it was. And it just goes to show that when we educate the public about these issues, when we have elected officials that are willing to really look at this and understand these issues meaningfully, we can bring really a broad base of support behind these kinds of reforms. So in Washington, D.C., we had support of the chair of the Judiciary Committee behind this bill to expand second look to emerging adults. The Attorney General supported this reform, as well as crime survivors and their advocates as well, coming behind this reform so that we can scale back extreme sentencing and make more effective investments in crime prevention. So another part of this report that I want to highlight is the way that we laid out the empirical foundation in support of second look reforms and how it inspired legal experts to advocate for these kinds of remedies. So we at the Sentencing Project, in thinking about second look and extreme sentencing broadly, we make the point that extreme sentences are counterproductive for public safety. Not just that they're not effective, but counterproductive. And so let me explain why that is. So the first two reasons are about why extreme sentences are not effective. And that has to do first with the fact that people age out of criminal activity. Many people are likely to commit crimes. If they're going to do it, they will do it as teenagers or in their early 20s. And as they get older, as they get finished, as they are done with school, as they get employed, as they get married, as they have children, they move out of that kind of lifestyle. So for example, the well-noted noted criminologist Alex Picaro has said that most criminal careers typically last 10 years. And so based on that, parole experts like Edward Ryan, the late Joan Petersilia from California, and Kevin Reitz, they've recommended that everyone become eligible for second look resentencing after 10 years of imprisonment. That's also our recommendation at the Sentencing Project, and it's also reflected in the federal second look bill that was proposed by Senators Cory Booker and Representative Karen Bass, resentencing after 10 years of imprisonment. So the other thing to understand about long sentences is that they're not effective for deterring criminal activity. So you might think, it might be a reasonable hunch that if we threaten people with extreme sentences, we can get them to not do terrible things, not harm their communities. But when you look at the data and how crime actually works, it doesn't fit, because many people commit crimes under the influence of drugs or alcohol or under great emotional duress. They're not thinking about the long-term consequences of their actions. If they're young people or emerging adults, they're especially not equipped mentally to make those kinds of considerations. And they're also oftentimes don't know what the penalties are that they might face if they're caught. And then this is the most important part of it. They don't expect to be caught. And it's actually not an unreasonable expectation. Many people commit crime without getting caught. And that's why if we want to deter crime and prevent it from happening in the first place, locking up the people who are caught for very long terms is not going to prevent other people from engaging in criminal activity. And then the part about long sentences not being counterproductive has to do with the costs. Like you were mentioning, the extremely high cost of incarcerating people gets even higher when you look at older people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. When we incarcerate that population, we end up providing not very good quality healthcare to them, but the healthcare that we do provide, and they have very high needs in that age, is much more expensive to provide in prison facilities and with guards accompanying them to the hospital if they have to go, compared to if we let them get that care in the community. And so it's in that sense that extreme sentences are counterproductive. We're spending a lot of money to incarcerate people who don't pose a public safety risk, and we could be making much more effective investments to prevent crime from happening in the first place. And so it's based on research like this and understanding of criminal activity and the consequences of criminal sanctions that organizations like the American Law Institute, who drafts the model penal code, they've recommended that everyone get a judicial review of their sentence after 15 years of imprisonment, and that for youth crimes, this happens after 10 years. And as they explain, this has to do with being responsive to evolving norms around what society thinks is appropriate punishment, as well as the evolving knowledge base that we have about what works to keep our communities safer.
Well, and I just want to follow up on one of the things that you said. I think sometimes people, they think that eligibility translates to you just get out, right? And I think that what we try to really make sure that people understand is that just because somebody is eligible, right, it doesn't necessarily translate to everybody is just going to get out. Can you speak a little bit to what you're seeing on the national landscape about the translation between being eligible and then the review process that happens?
Absolutely. So there is, for example, with DC's second look law, there is a set of criteria that judges review to see if the person has been rehabilitated, if it's safe to release them. We see some people do not make it even after they've petitioned. And so it's really important in the review process to consider, meaningful assessments of public safety. And is this person, if they're released, how is it going to affect the community based on their track record in prison, based on the programming that they did voluntarily in some cases? Some of the people that we see that have been released so far through these mechanisms are really exemplary individuals. It's just shocking to think about how long they were kept behind bars, and that they might have still been behind bars if it were not for these kinds of reforms. But as we move past these really exemplary individuals, we'll hopefully get to the point where we're looking at people who they're just like the rest of us, right? In terms of they have not written 10 books during their period of incarceration, right? We can see that they're not going to pose any greater public safety risk than the rest of us that are living in our communities.
Right, right. We talk about that a lot. We certainly have people that we have worked with and are home now, and they're working in tech, or they receive multiple degrees. But we really always try to remind everybody that that's not the standard. But it does go to show how much work people are putting in for their day to come before the court. And I also just appreciate what you're saying, because again, there's a lot of misperceptions that this is going to negatively affect public safety, and the fact that there are all these checks and balances that are built in. I think anybody that's following along or listening today should just have some assurances that public safety is front and center, certainly for our organization. And with that, I'll actually turn it over and invite DA Reisig to this conversation, who has spent his career focusing on public safety, spent his career on supporting victims, spent his career on weighing these types of questions. So with that, I'll ask you. I mean, you spent your career as a gang prosecutor and have been now the elected district attorney of Yolo County for a number of years. Tell us why this type of work and this law resonated with you, and why you've been such a champion of it.
Sure. Well, this is my 26th year as a prosecutor, and starting 16 as the elected DA. And it's safe to say that when I became a prosecutor all those years ago, it was during a very different time in our country, and particularly in California. It was the height of the tough on crime era, and there were really tough laws coming out of the legislature. There was a lot of feeling in the community that punishments needed to be harder and tougher and longer. And that was kind of where we were in history at that time. What I like to say now is, we've evolved. Society's evolved. People are evolving. Prosecutors are evolving, and how we look at a lot of the crime issues. And that's not to say that we don't still, have a need for criminal courts and prisons. We do. There are, people that do need to be sent to prison, but not everybody. And certainly not for the length of time that some of these people were during the tough on crime era. And so, now looking back at some of the sentences that were handed down, whether it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you can really, at least I do, I just kind of go, wow, like that was way too long under the current analysis of those same crimes. And so that's kind of what brought me into this, and just the feeling as a prosecutor that, we have an ongoing duty to make sure justice is done. And if you look at some of these sentences where people are doing double-digit terms for a crime where nobody was hurt, that's not justice, not today. And we can do something to fix it with this law.
And one of the questions that we get from prosecutors that have not done this work, or just getting themselves familiarized with how it's working, they ask the question about, well, why should the prosecutor be involved in this? Isn't this the duty of the governor with commutation, or the parole board? Some states don't have a parole board, so or a governor that's even doing commutations. But we get that question, that is the prosecutor reaching into an area of the criminal justice system that's just not their responsibility to do?
I don't think so at all. I mean, the prosecutors have the most intimate knowledge of these cases. They were prosecuted out of our offices. We've met with the witnesses and the victims. And the victim piece, which has been mentioned, is huge. We are able to have ongoing conversations with the people who are involved in these cases about issues like this, whether release is appropriate. So I just think that our factual understanding of the cases, the facts, the people, and the system from which these sentences were given is critical. And it gives us that, I think, an important seat at the table on these kind of decisions.
I want to ask you, you mentioned victims. That's another question that we get a lot. There's this again, I feel like this whole webinar is about clearing up some of the misperceptions out there about this work and helping to educate people that are tuning in today. We get this question a lot. What about victims? And what about truth in sentencing? What about finality of judgment? And can you speak a little bit to how the victims have been incorporated, consulted with, often, almost every single case I know that you've worked on, but can you speak a little bit about that? If there's any crime survivors that are listening today, how they are included and how their rights are protected through this process?
It's a great question. And it's, for me, in the way that we've used the law in my county, victims are a critical part of the analysis that we go through. We bring them into the conversation to talk to them about what we're considering, that we're looking at an individual to determine whether or not we should ask a judge to resentence. And their opinion and their input is critical. And I'm very aware, and every prosecutor I think that is on this call, we have a special relationship with victims of crime. And we don't want to engage in a process that ignores them or re-traumatizes them at all. And that's what's great about PIR, is that it empowers prosecutors to have those robust conversations with victims about the circumstances and why somebody may have earned a second chance. And my experience has been, and I think we've done over 10 of these and we've had several more we're looking at, when we have those conversations with victims and they see the whole picture that we see, they agree. They haven't disagreed with us yet. And so, when I talk to prosecutors around the country about this law, I tell them, you are empowered to do justice and bring the victims into this discussion. And it's better than any other law out there in that regard, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. I want to ask a follow-up to that around the whole picture. You mentioned the whole picture, that when you are able to talk to the victims and share with them the whole picture, right? And so I know that in the work that we've been doing and what other prosecutors are doing, especially in partnership with community-based organizations and public defender offices, is actually going back, right? It's going back to what was this person's childhood like? Right? How many times did they fall through the cracks? How often were they victims themselves? So I know that this whole picture is part of something that is a priority for you to look at. I'm curious about, we do the work that we do, as you know, is focusing on the back end. We know that there's organizations out there that are an incredible work that's happening on the front end, alternatives to incarceration and diversion programs. But I am curious, when you look at the whole picture of the criminal justice process, I'm curious about what impacts, if any, has this work had on you in how you look at the front end of cases, right? We're reviewing and analyzing the final outcome and going all the way back and looking kind of backwards, right, at what has happened in a particular case. Has this had any impact on how you're now looking at cases that are coming into your office?
It absolutely has. I mean, this process that we have engaged in with PIR, looking at, as you said, a person's childhood and risk factors and whether there was drug use or any mental illness. These are all things that now, we are looking at on the front end much more robustly than we ever have before. And again, part of that, I think, has just come with the evolution of the criminal justice system. We have many more programs now across California to address some of these issues, whether they're mental health courts, intervention courts for addiction, restorative justice programs. There's things that we have now that really require us to do a deeper dive into who is the individual that is being accused of the crime. And so, yeah, I've said this to you many times. I mean, doing this work on the back end with you and for the people has really, for my entire team, compelled us to have much more robust discussions about who these folks are when we're looking at what's appropriate on the front end.
Great. That's good. That's good to hear. I mean, it wasn't something, you know, again, our efforts in this work was really about we knew that there were thousands of people in prison that didn't need to be there. We needed a mechanism to find them, to get their stories. But it has certainly been a surprising, and we're really enthusiastic that has been the impact. And we've been hearing that from other prosecutors across the state, that it's kind of changing the way that they're looking at cases, even on the front end. And I know, as a former prosecutor myself, oftentimes things are moving so fast. I sometimes didn't pay enough attention to the stories that the defense attorney might have been sharing with me about some of the mitigation and some of the experiences that the person was experiencing. And so I'm glad to see that it sounds like there's a little bit of a pause to be able to reflect and take in some of that information. So that is great to hear. So with that, speaking of stories, I would like to turn now to Mr. Troy Dunmore. And we are so grateful that you took time out of your schedule to be here to talk to us. And I just want to open it up and just ask you, you know, you got a letter, you were notified that your case was going to be reviewed. The San Diego District Attorney's Office, you know, resentenced your case. You're now here living in Oakland and working full time. I want to kind of go back and just tell us, you know, what was going on through your mind when you learned that you were going to get resentenced and come back home.
First of all, I say good morning to everybody, and it was surreal, because I want to go back a little bit in time when they sent me the letter in August of 2020, when we were going through the COVID at San Quentin. So in the letter, they mentioned that we're just looking at it. This is no guarantees, and we're going to screen it first before we send to San Diego. So the process took over a year. So when I finally got I made the call to the public defender, and she told me they wanted to offer you 17 years. It was surreal, joy. I was going to see my mother and father. I was getting another chance at life. It was just, I was numb and very extremely happy.
How did it feel knowing that it was going to be the prosecutor that was right? That was the one that was actually making the motion to resentence and bring you home.
Well, as everybody knows, San Diego was always known for, tough on crime. So when I heard that the prosecutor from San Diego was willing to do it, I kind of thought it was a joke. Not a joke, but like, yeah, they're going to rubber stamp it. They're just trying to, get involved in this movement. So I was very humbled that they're looking at the big picture. Like the prosecutor there said, that they're looking at the whole story. I mean, I committed the crimes, because I'm talking about crimes that I was committed for in my past. But at the same time, they're looking at, they're looking at the whole story. So it was good that she, I know her name is Summer Stephan, I think, that she's actually taking a look at it and going to, continue to do that and try to help other people that are ready. I believe that there's so many people right now that I know that are ready to come home, but just because they're from a certain county, that they're not even getting a look at.
Right. I mean, every single person that has comes home with a list, right? They come home and they have a list of the people, whether it was a former cellmate or somebody in a program, but they're like, there is a list of people that you need to also be looking at and getting these folks home. I want to ask you about, you have enrolled in courses, you're working full time. I know that you are doing great. What is it? And I think many people that are tuning in right now have experience supporting folks that are going through the reentry process. I'm curious from you, what are the most important things that you have been able to receive that have been the most helpful?
I would say, first of all, I had a plan before I was released. I had a plan before this even happened. I was doing things in my life to get ready for the possible event that I paroled. And I just want to add that today was actually the day of my parole board day that they set for me. It was February 18th at 1:30. So years ago, I was planning to maybe get out one day when they changed the law, I think the elderly or nonviolent. And so for me, it was having a plan. And then when I was paroled, I went to Dream Center in Oakland, and they have a great job developer there. And that helped because the job that I thought I was going to get fell through. So I would just say trying to have a plan, you know, long before you get to this stage. And most people that I know, that's what we all do. We understand that things might not happen exactly the way that we think they're going to happen. Matter of fact, it didn't for me, but having a plan and then asking for help. You know, I never really used to ask for help. I would just try to do it on my own or not do it. And not being afraid to ask other people for help, because there is help in this county and there's probably help in other counties. But I would have to say just having a plan.
And for the people that are joining today and who have loved ones that are currently incarcerated, and then even for prosecutors that are joining today, what advice would you give to people in getting them ready for the day that they get a letter? You know, what are some of the things that people can do to really strengthen their ability to tell their story and have the judge agree to have somebody come back home?
First of all, I said don't lose hope, and for the families to know that your loved one is incarcerated and most likely they're in there, you know, continuing to do good, but just have hope and do what we can. Like I was telling Christina that the biggest thing that I think that they can do is try to get some type of computer skills. I don't know if they have them to that degree in prison, but the hardest thing for me right now is trying to navigate, you know, my job. I have to put data in the computer. So I would say learn computer skills and continue to educate yourself. Continue, you know, whatever you may want to do, just try to get, you know, understanding on that and continue to move down that path. And for families, just don't lose hope and just love them, you know, just love them.
And can you share a little bit about your family that was here loving on you and helping you from the outside?
Absolutely. I have a father in the Bay Area, and I have my mother in San Diego, and I have family in both places. So I was fortunate that my family never disowned me, which they could have a whole bunch of times. And from the time that I was incarcerated, you know, when I was arrested in 1995, up until the moment that I was paroled, my family's always been there. Not that they condone what I did, because they don't, but they love me and they continue to love me and continue just to support me. And that right there is, you know, like they're in there, my mother and father in their 80s. And that's helped me because was fortunate enough to have that family support. So when I was in prison, I was able to focus on what I needed to do for me, because I don't know if anyone knows that it's hard to survive on a roll of toilet paper a week, 5 stamped envelopes, you know, the things that we get for free. And so a lot of people come in with that background of, well, I don't know how to survive, because yes, they do feed us, but I need more than one roll of toilet paper a week or whatever the case may be. So we get caught up in these hustling to survive in prison. What I mean, survive basic necessities. So for me, I was able to just focus on going to education, going to self-help groups, trying to get myself together. So that support right there helped me continue my path. And I can just focus on what I needed to do for me.
Right. And I think what's so important about what you just said, Troy, for DAs that are listening to this conversation is how much focus and dedication and hard work you had to put in just to survive, to take the classes, to complete the classes, to go to group, to do the insight work. I mean, we look at some of the work that has been done from folks inside, and it is so remarkable that I don't think many of us could say that we could put in that kind of really hard work on ourselves. And so I think thank you for sharing that with all of us.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, please go ahead.
That type of work is self-esteem building, because for me, I'm speaking about me, when I came to prison, my self-esteem was very, very low, because I understood that I've had chances before I came on this commitment. So as I was going to college and getting pretty good grades, and then my grades got better, that kind of helped me say, you know, I can do this. I can actually go to college. I can actually write essays. I can do these formulas in algebra. I can do this. I can do whatever I want if I apply myself. So it helped me build. So now I'm okay. I can do it. So I continue to grow from that, because you know, I'm only speaking for my circumstances, that I had a very, very low self-esteem. And so that helps the person become whole to when we get out. Okay, I can function in society. I can go out here and whatever I wanted to do, not whatever I wanted to do, but the vision that I have for me, I can achieve it if I put the hard work. And I don't care what anybody says over here, I can do it. And that right there is, it's like priceless.
Right. I want to ask you one more question. I want to ask you 50 more questions, but I'm going to ask you one more question about what you do today, right? When we talked earlier, and you know, there's this people will say, well, you know, getting people out of prison, that's going to impact public safety, and you're letting out dangerous people that are going to go out and commit more crimes. We always say, no, no, no. In fact, most of the people that are coming home are going and giving back and helping others. So can you share what you do for your job as a counselor?
Absolutely. I'm a drug counselor, and that's one of the ways I want to honor my victims, because I'm a formerly, you know, I'm a substance abuse. I used to use drugs, and I have years clean, and I understood what it did in the community, using drugs and what goes along with that, crime. So I honor my victims by trying to give back and helping other people, because I looked at it, everyone that was around me that was on drugs, we were committing crimes. So I honor my victims every day. I don't, you know, try to diminish what I've done, and not like I always want to mention, not for right now, for the crime I'm here, for all the crimes that I've done, the crimes that I've got away with. So I try to honor my victims by doing this work, and it's not the greatest pay, but it's what I want to do. It helps me, and I can give back to somebody else.
Well, and you could do other things, and the fact that you've chosen this work to support people who may, you know, that are in the shoes that you may have been in before, and interrupting all of that and helping them get them on a different path. Thank you so much, because you don't have to do that. But again, it's what we hear time and time again of people that are coming home. They're not coming home for their own freedom. They're coming home to free others. So thank you. I'm looking at the chat. It's blowing up with so many comments about your story, blessings and people crying. And so thank you so much for sharing your story. So with that, we will open it up. We've got 9 more minutes to open it up to some questions for our panelists. And let's see here. So I'm going to just jump to the question here from Samantha Roberts, who is at the San Francisco DA's office. Her question is for you, Troy. Where were you able to learn about technology and computers? Was the program through the Dream Center? Was it helpful? And just for everybody, if you could share where you were able to get access to that information. I also know that there are people in other institutions that unfortunately cannot get access to programs. So if you can share a little bit about what you were able to access and some of the tensions around classes not being available.
Yes. When I was in 2018, I took a basic computer class, but I thought that I can navigate with that. But if you're not using it, you know, you take a 6-month class and then they cycle new people. And so I didn't use it from 2018 until in 22, where I got hired into 2021. So Dream Center has an excellent program where they bring in volunteers, and they have a beginner's class, and you have a tutor right with you, And you know, I happen to have a laptop, but if you don't have a laptop, they'll provide one for you. And you every week, I think it's like 8 weeks. And then, so I'm getting ready to go to the intermediate one. So it's like I have the opportunity to continue to grow. But Dream Center, I would say really Dream Center, that they offer it for us.
Great, great. And then we have a question for DA Reisig. Can you give some specific tips for effectively advocating for somebody in this process? So if somebody has a loved one, what is the most helpful information for you in your decision-making?
It's a great question. We really are interested in hearing about the support that folks will have if they come back into the community. We always like to hear about the reentry plan, the family members that intend to be present to support the individual, jobs that are available, if they're needing treatment and that type of support. We'd like to see all that and know that the family is going to rally around family or friends or loved ones to really support this person as they're coming out. We also like to hear from any of their loved ones about how the person has changed. Those are really powerful stories. So I think that's, you know, a summary of what we like to see from the family members.
Great. Hope that's helpful for the question that came in. And again, I think we can provide a little bit more details to that. You can look on our website for some more information, and also a report because there's a lot of information in there. And then a question for you, Nazgol, doctor. Can you share if there's anything happening with respect to Second Look? There's a question around Pennsylvania, and if you can share some of just the high level on Second Look sentencing statutes that are moving across the country.
Sure thing. So we shared earlier in the chat a list that FAM has put together on ongoing second look legislation around the country. So you can learn more about your state or the state that you're interested in there. And there is an active campaign in Pennsylvania to create second look remedy there.
Great, thank you for that. Yes, that they have like an interactive map. So you can get very up to date, and there it is in the chat right now as well. I wanted to, there's a question about, are all the 9 counties included in the pilot here today? I'm not sure about whether all of those counties are here, but if you wanted to go to our website, there is a map that will show you which of the counties have received funding as part of this pilot program. And then will this recording be available? The recording will be posted on our website, so you can rewatch it or share with others. And then in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to actually ask all of the panelists a question. We want to be hopeful, and we've certainly made great strides with this law here in California and also in other parts of the country. So I wanted to ask each of you what you see as the challenge ahead and what you see as what you're the most hopeful for. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh, the big challenge and what you're hopeful for.
Sure. So let's see. The big challenge, I think, is to move these reforms up to scale. And I think that PIR is really doing a lot to create grounds that, where we can build on additional reforms. So, by bringing people into the community who can be released, prosecutors can also have a role to play in addressing potential racial disparities in who's incarcerated. So, for example, in really thinking closely about when someone has disciplinary violations that they acquired while they were in prison, or if they don't have the best psychological evaluation, taking into consideration whether there's potential racial bias that's driving that and taking that into consideration. So I think that there's a lot of promise in terms of the way that prosecutors can help to create successful cases as well as begin to mitigate racial disparities. And I'm very hopeful that because, a decade ago when I started thinking about these issues, we didn't have reformed prosecutors on the landscape that were, in many jurisdictions that I could point to that were interested in this kind of work. And we also didn't have folks like Mr. Dunmore, who was out and setting such a great example and a voice that people could hear from directly as part of this movement. And so I think that's very promising to have that range of people coming to the table and thinking about how to fix some of these problems.
Thank you for that. I will ask the same question of you, DA Reisig, the big challenge and what you're hopeful for.
The big challenge is that because this process is driven locally, you literally have to look state by state and county by county and hope that you find a DA that's willing to undertake this work. And that's a challenge because there's a lot involved. There's politics, there's the constituency's views towards punishment and rehabilitation. And there's just so many moving parts in that analysis. So that's the challenge, right? I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that this is going to become the new normal, PIR. And I'm talking to my colleagues, elected DAs across the country and across California, and I'm sharing with them my own experience with it and how it is such a rewarding tool for prosecutors to use. It's the right thing to do in the right cases. And our job is to make sure justice is done, and that never stops. And if there is a sentence that needs to be corrected, we can fix it and we should fix it. And what I'm really hopeful about is that message is resonating with prosecutors, whether they're reform prosecutors or traditional prosecutors or left or right. That message is resonating with a lot of people. And so I'm hopeful.
Great. And we will end with you, Mr. Dunmore. Tell us what you see as the challenge ahead and what you are the most hopeful for with this new tool.
The biggest challenge that I see is just fairness. Because I was able to get out through For the People, and then they have another mechanism through CDCR that they view people for, and they exclude people for this, exclude people for that. So just fairness. And what I'm the hope that I have is this movement will continue to grow, and people like me and other people that are out doing, just working, staying out of trouble, focusing on just bettering their life will continue. People will see that, we can let some of these people out. We can let more out because most people, I think you say, we aged out. I just want to say one thing. I didn't change for the board. I didn't change for 1170D. I didn't change for anything. I just wanted to figure out, man, how did I wind up in this point with 65 years to life? And it just came to me on my own. It wasn't I wasn't going to get out. So I believe a lot of people are like that. They just, one day they just go, you know what, whatever happened in the past, I'm here. I want to figure it out. And so I believe that there's other people just like me. They just need opportunity.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We are going to work very hard on the challenges that you have named here, and that we're certainly knowledgeable of as well. And we're going to end this though with holding on to the hope that you all have said here, because like Mr. Dunmore has said, there are so many other people that deserve to be home right now with their families and back in their communities. And so that's what we're all going to be fighting for. Thank you, everybody that tuned in. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. Maybe we should have gone for an hour and a half, but we decided to keep it an hour. We will have another webinar to continue to talk about these issues and questions with other panelists. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in and giving us your time, and especially thank you to all of our panelists for your candor, for your commitment, and for leaving us with this message of hope. So thank you.